Danielle Whitfield sat across from the man she had loved for 17 years and watched him sign his name with a flourish, like he was closing a business deal instead of ending a marriage. Marcus didn't even look up at her. He slid the pen across the table, told his lawyer he was ready for lunch, and said the words that would replay in Danielle's mind for the next 3 years. He looked at her, almost smiling, and said she would learn to live with less, that she had never really understood what it took to build something, that the life she was walking away from was more than she deserved in the first place. What Marcus Whitfield did not know, what he could not have known in that moment of quiet cruelty, was that the very papers he rushed her to sign, the papers his own lawyer drafted in a hurry to close the deal before Danielle could think twice, would one day be the reason federal investigators showed up at his office with a folder that had his name printed at the very top. 3 years later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, Marcus was standing in the lobby of the company he built, greeting a client, feeling untouchable, when a man in a grey suit walked through the front doors and asked to speak with him privately. Marcus didn't know it yet, but the woman he had once dismissed as someone who did nothing real, someone who simply stood beside him while he made all the money and all the decisions, was the reason that man was standing in his lobby at all. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is the story of Danielle Whitfield, a woman Marcus underestimated in every way that mattered, and the mistake he made on the day he thought he had won. Who was the man in the grey suit, and why was he really there? What did Danielle know that Marcus never bothered to ask her about? And what exactly did Marcus force her to sign in the rush to end their marriage quickly? A document he never reread, never questioned, never imagined could someday become the very thing that unraveled everything he had spent his life building. By the end of this story, you will understand how a woman written off as nothing more than a housewife became the one detail Marcus Whitfield forgot to account for, and how the biggest mistake of his life was not the affair, not the divorce, but the one signature he never bothered to think twice about. To understand how Danielle Whitfield ended up sitting across from her husband on the worst day of her life, you have to go back 17 years, to a small apartment in Charlotte, North Carolina, where a 25-year-old Marcus Whitfield was trying to get a construction business off the ground with nothing but a used pickup truck, a handful of subcontractor contacts, and more ambition than money. Danielle was 23 then, working as a receptionist for an architecture firm downtown, and she was the one who noticed Marcus standing outside the building one afternoon, staring up at a half-finished renovation like he was trying to memorize every detail of how it had been built. She struck up a conversation with him out of simple curiosity, and within 6 months they were inseparable, within a year they were married, and within 2 years Danielle had quietly become the backbone of a business that would eventually carry both their names on paper, but only one name in every conversation that mattered. Their wedding had been small, held in the backyard of Danielle's parents' home in Greensboro, with folding chairs borrowed from a nearby church and a cake made by Danielle's aunt, because neither of them could afford anything more elaborate at the time. Marcus had given a toast that evening that Danielle would remember for years afterward, telling the small gathering of family and friends that everything he built for the rest of his life would be built alongside Danielle, that he could not imagine a version of his success that did not include her standing beside him every step of the way. Their first daughter was born less than 2 years later, followed by their second daughter 3 years after that, and Danielle managed both the growing demands of motherhood and an increasingly active role in Marcus's expanding business, often working from a laptop propped on the kitchen counter while a toddler napped in the next room. Danielle was not a passive partner in those early years. She was the one who built the first client intake system, who negotiated with suppliers when Marcus was too proud to ask for better terms, who sat up late at the kitchen table reconciling invoices while Marcus slept, exhausted from a day on job sites. She learned contract law well enough to catch errors in vendor agreements before they became expensive problems. She learned how municipal bidding worked, how permits moved through city offices, how to read a balance sheet the way most people read a grocery list. Marcus never once thanked her publicly for any of it. In front of clients, in front of subcontractors, in front of his own family, he was the builder, the visionary, the man who had come from nothing and built an empire through sheer will. Danielle was simply his wife, the woman who kept his household running so he could focus on what he called the real work. For the first 10 years, Danielle told herself this arrangement made sense. She had chosen to step back from her own career ambitions to support what they were building together, and she believed, the way many people believe when they are inside a marriage rather than looking at it from the outside, that credit would eventually catch up to contribution. She believed that Marcus understood, even if he never said it out loud, how much of the business's early stability rested on decisions she had made quietly in the background. She raised their 2 children largely on her own during the years when Marcus's company was expanding fastest, taking on larger municipal contracts, hiring more crews, moving into commercial development. She managed the household finances so precisely that Marcus never once had to think about whether a bill was paid or a tax deadline was met. She was, by every honest measure, a co-architect of the life they shared. But somewhere around year 12, something in Marcus began to change, and Danielle started noticing it in small, easy-to-dismiss ways before it became impossible to ignore. He started coming home later, citing site visits that didn't always match the hours on his calendar. He started speaking to her differently in front of other people, correcting her mid-sentence at dinners with business associates, making small jokes at her expense that always landed just close enough to true to sting. She noticed new cologne, a haircut he hadn't had in years, a level of attention to his appearance that had nothing to do with job sites or client meetings. When she finally asked him directly if something was going on, he told her she was imagining things, that success had made her paranoid, that she should be grateful for the life he had built for her instead of looking for problems that didn't exist. Danielle wanted to believe him. She wanted it badly enough that she let the conversation end there, even as a quiet and steady discomfort continued to settle into her chest every time his phone buzzed at odd hours. Looking back, Danielle would later describe that period as the loneliest stretch of her marriage, lonelier even than the eventual discovery of the affair itself, because it was defined by a persistent, unnamed doubt she had no way of confirming or dismissing. She found herself replaying conversations, noticing small inconsistencies in stories about where Marcus had been, and then immediately talking herself out of her own suspicions, telling herself that 17 years of trust should count for more than a handful of odd details. She continued managing the household, continued handling parts of the business Marcus still occasionally asked her to help with, and continued presenting a united front at community events and church functions, all while carrying a growing unease she felt she had no right to voice without proof. The woman's name was Tasha, and Danielle learned about her not through confrontation, but through the mundane, almost anticlimactic discovery of a hotel receipt left in a jacket pocket that went to the dry cleaner. She sat with that receipt for 3 days before she said anything to Marcus, turning it over in her mind, trying to decide whether confronting him would blow up a life she had spent 17 years building, or whether staying silent would slowly kill something in her that she still needed to survive. When she finally showed him the receipt, Marcus didn't deny it the way she expected him to. He simply looked at her with an expression she would later describe as relief, as though he had been waiting for an excuse to stop pretending. He told her their marriage had run its course, that he had outgrown the life they built together, and that it was time for both of them to move on. Danielle sat in stunned silence, realizing that the decision had already been made for her, somewhere in a hotel room she would never see, on a night she would never be able to reclaim. What followed was not a slow, careful unwinding of a shared life, but a fast, aggressive push toward finalization that Danielle would only fully understand the purpose of much later. Marcus hired an attorney named Griffin Okafor, a man known in Charlotte legal circles for closing settlements quickly and efficiently, often to the disadvantage of the less prepared party. Within 2 weeks of Danielle discovering the affair, Marcus's attorney had already drafted a settlement proposal, one that offered Danielle a modest lump sum, limited ongoing support, and full separation from any involvement in the business she had helped build from its earliest days. Marcus framed it to her as generous, as more than fair given how quickly he wanted things resolved, and he pushed hard for Danielle to sign without dragging the process out through what he called an unnecessary and expensive legal battle. He wanted this finished before it could become complicated, and Danielle, still reeling from betrayal, exhausted and uncertain of her own footing, very nearly gave him exactly what he wanted. It was Danielle's cousin, a woman named Odessa who had gone through her own difficult divorce years earlier, who convinced her not to sign anything without her own attorney reviewing every page first. Odessa gave her the name of Renata Cole, a family law attorney with a reputation for reading contracts the way most people read warning labels, carefully, skeptically, and with an eye for language that seemed harmless on the surface but carried consequences underneath. Danielle called Renata the same week, and within their first meeting, Renata asked Danielle a question that would end up mattering more than either of them understood at the time. She asked Danielle whether she had ever been listed as a signatory, officer, or beneficial owner on any business entity connected to Marcus's company, even informally, even temporarily, even years earlier for reasons that seemed unimportant at the time. Danielle thought about it for a long moment before she remembered something she had nearly forgotten entirely. Roughly 6 years into the marriage, Marcus had asked her to sign paperwork establishing a separate holding entity, something he explained at the time as a routine business structure recommended by his accountant for tax efficiency on certain equipment leases and subcontractor arrangements. Danielle remembered signing several documents that day without reading every line closely, trusting Marcus's explanation the way a spouse trusts a spouse after years of shared decision-making. She had not thought about that entity in years. She barely remembered its name. But she told Renata what she recalled, and Renata, without saying much at the time, made a note to pull records on every business entity associated with Marcus Whitfield before Danielle signed a single page of the divorce settlement. The weeks that followed were tense in a way Danielle had never experienced before in her marriage. Marcus's attorney pushed for speed, sending revised settlement drafts every few days, each one framed as the final version, each one arriving with subtle pressure attached, reminders that dragging out the process would only cost Danielle more in legal fees, warnings that Marcus's patience for what he called unnecessary delay was running thin. Danielle sat through these weeks, feeling the full weight of 17 years of marriage reduced to a negotiation over paperwork, watching the man she had built a life with treat the end of that life as nothing more than a transaction he wanted closed as efficiently as possible. She did not yet know what Renata had discovered in the background, and Renata, careful and deliberate by nature, did not tell her everything right away, preferring to gather a complete picture before raising anything that might complicate an already painful process. Marcus, for his part, grew visibly frustrated with each passing week that the settlement remained unsigned, complaining to friends that Danielle was being unreasonable, that she had never cared about the business enough to have any real claim to it, and that her sudden insistence on reviewing every detail felt to him like spite rather than genuine concern. He pushed Griffin to find ways to accelerate the process, at one point suggesting they simply offer Danielle a modest increase in the lump sum payment if it meant closing the deal faster, a proposal Renata firmly rejected on Danielle's behalf, explaining that no amount of additional cash was worth signing away rights to an asset whose true value and purpose remained unclear. Marcus could not understand this resistance. In his mind, the marriage was already over in every way that mattered, and the paperwork was simply a formality standing between him and the life he was eager to begin building with Tasha. What Renata found, buried in state business filings that most people would never think to check, was that the holding entity Danielle had signed paperwork for years earlier still listed her as a co-owner, and that this entity had never been formally dissolved or transferred, despite Marcus's later claims to his own attorney that it was inactive and irrelevant to the divorce. More curiously, Renata noticed that this entity had, over the past several years, been used in a handful of subcontractor agreements tied to city infrastructure projects, agreements that on paper looked routine, but that Renata, with her experience in reviewing financial disclosures during divorce proceedings, found unusually structured. She did not yet know what any of it meant. She only knew it was worth protecting rather than signing away, and she quietly advised Danielle to refuse any settlement language that required her to relinquish her ownership interest in that entity, no matter how small or unimportant Marcus's attorney insisted it was. Danielle had grown up in a household where her own mother, a school teacher in Greensboro, had spent 30 years being quietly overlooked by a school system that promoted louder, less capable colleagues around her simply because she never demanded credit for the work she did. Danielle had watched that pattern play out across her mother's entire career, and she had promised herself as a young woman that she would never let herself disappear inside someone else's success story the way her mother had. It was a promise she believed she was keeping in the early years of her marriage to Marcus, when she saw her contributions as a genuine partnership rather than a slow erosion of her own identity. It was only in hindsight, sitting in Renata's office reviewing settlement drafts, that she began to recognize how closely her own marriage had come to repeating the exact pattern she had sworn to avoid. Renata used those early meetings to prepare Danielle for what she called the emotional undertow of divorce proceedings, the way exhaustion and grief can push even capable, intelligent people toward agreeing to terms they would never accept under normal circumstances. She encouraged Danielle to write down, in her own words, every contribution she had made to the business over the years, not for the court necessarily, but so Danielle herself would have a clear, undeniable record to return to whenever Marcus's team suggested she had been nothing more than a bystander in her own life. Danielle spent an entire weekend filling nearly 40 pages with memories, decisions, negotiations, and late nights that had never once appeared in any official company document, and reading back over those pages gave her something she had not expected, a quiet, steady anger that replaced the numb sadness she had been carrying since discovering the affair. Marcus was furious when his attorney reported back that Danielle was refusing to sign away her interest in what Griffin Ocaffer dismissed as an old, dormant holding company. He could not understand why Danielle, a woman he had spent months insisting knew nothing about the business, was suddenly holding firm on a detail so small it barely seemed worth mentioning to him in the first place. He pushed Griffin to draft language that would bury the ownership transfer inside a broader release of claims, hoping Danielle's attorney would miss it among dozens of other clauses, or that Danielle herself, exhausted and eager to be done with the process, would simply sign without reading closely. This is precisely the moment where Marcus Whitfield made the mistake that would define the rest of his life, though he had absolutely no way of understanding that yet. The final settlement meeting took place on a grey October afternoon in a conference room on the 14th floor of a law office in downtown Charlotte, the kind of room with a long table, bottled water nobody drank, and the particular silence that settles allotment company, run by a man named Terence Ashford, who had lost several bids to Marcus's team over the previous 2 years. Became an early focus of scrutiny after an anonymous tip suggested Ashford's firm might be manipulating bid documents to undercut competitors unfairly. Wallace spent nearly 3 weeks examining Ashford's filings before concluding that while Ashford's bidding practices were aggressive, they showed no evidence of the coordinated pattern investigators were actually looking for. This detour cost valuable time, but it also had the effect of keeping Marcus's business entirely off the radar of anyone outside Danielle's small circle, allowing Wallace and Renata to continue building a clearer picture without alerting Marcus that anything was being examined at all. A second false lead emerged several weeks later, this time closer to home. One of Marcus's longtime project managers, a man named Deshorn Riley, who had grown increasingly resentful over being passed over for a promotion, had been overheard at an industry mixer making vague comments about knowing things that could damage Marcus's reputation if he ever chose to speak up. Investigators, still working carefully to avoid tipping off Marcus directly, spent almost a month quietly looking into whether Riley himself might be behind irregularities in the bidding process, wondering if a disgruntled employee had manipulated internal records out of spite rather than profit. Wallace eventually determined that Riley's comments had nothing to do with the bidding scheme at all, and everything to do with unrelated frustrations about overtime pay, a dead end that nonetheless reinforced just how many people inside and around Marcus's company had quietly sensed something was not right. Even if none of them understood the full shape of what was actually happening, what the investigation revealed as it progressed was not simply a story about inflated contracts and manipulated paperwork, but a story with real consequences for ordinary people living in the neighborhoods those contracts were meant to serve. One of the 4 infrastructure projects tied to the scheme involved drainage improvements in a working-class neighborhood on the east side of Charlotte, an area that had flooded repeatedly during heavy rains for years before the city finally approved funding for updated stormwater systems. Because the winning bid, secured through the coordinated arrangement Marcus had built, was priced well above what honest competition would have produced, the actual materials and labor delivered fell noticeably short of what residents had been promised. Danielle learned, through records Wallace uncovered, that pipe specifications had been quietly downgraded midway through construction, a change never disclosed to the city inspectors who signed off on the final work. Danielle drove out to that neighborhood one afternoon during the months the investigation was unfolding, though she never told Wallace or Renata she had done it. She parked near the intersection where new drainage grates had been installed the previous year and watched a group of children playing in a yard that, according to residents she spoke with briefly, had still flooded twice since the supposed improvements were completed. She did not introduce herself as anyone connected to the case. She simply stood there for a while, understanding in a way she hadn't fully allowed herself to before that the paperwork sitting in her closet was not just about her own marriage or her own financial protection. It represented real harm done to families who had trusted that the money spent on their neighborhood would actually solve the problem it was meant to solve. She left that afternoon more certain than ever that coming forward had been the right decision, whatever it eventually meant for Marcus. Wallace's methodology, once investigators fully understood it, became a central part of how prosecutors eventually built their case. He had cross-referenced not just bid amounts and submission dates, but the specific software metadata embedded in the digital bid documents themselves, discovering that files submitted under 4 supposedly independent company names had all been created and edited using the same computer, down to a shared author name buried in the document properties that none of the companies had thought to remove before submission. This single detail, small and almost accidental, became one of the most damning pieces of physical evidence in the entire case, precisely the kind of overlooked technical fingerprint that separates a suspected pattern from a provable one in a courtroom. As Wallace's findings grew more detailed, Danielle found herself in an increasingly difficult position. She was not seeking to destroy Marcus. She had built a life apart from him, and much of her early anger over the divorce had settled into something closer to quiet acceptance. But the deeper Wallace's investigation went, the clearer it became that the holding entity was not simply an old, forgotten piece of paperwork. It was actively being used at that very moment to manipulate public contracts funded by taxpayer money, contracts for road repairs and drainage systems that affected real neighborhoods, real families. People who had no idea that the infrastructure improvements promised to their communities were being quietly overpriced and underdelivered because of a bidding scheme built on paperwork that still carried Danielle's name. It was this realization, more than any lingering resentment toward Marcus personally, that pushed Danielle to take her findings to the appropriate authorities rather than simply distancing herself and hoping the problem resolved on its own. Renata helped her understand her legal position clearly. As a documented co-owner of the entity in question, Danielle had both exposure and leverage. If she came forward proactively, cooperating fully with investigators and demonstrating that she had no active role in directing the scheme, she would very likely be treated as a cooperating witness rather than a subject of investigation herself. If she waited, and investigators eventually traced the entity back to her independently, her silence could easily be interpreted very differently. Danielle did not hesitate long once she understood the choice in those terms. Within 2 weeks, she and Renata had arranged a meeting with the State Attorney General's Public Corruption Unit, bringing with them Wallace's preliminary findings and every document Danielle had preserved from her marriage. The state investigators who reviewed Danielle's information moved with a seriousness that surprised even Wallace, who had expected the case to take months to gain traction. Within their first meeting, lead investigator Camille Voss recognized the pattern Wallace had identified as consistent with several other bid rigging cases her unit had prosecuted in neighboring counties over the previous 5 years. She explained to Danielle that cases like this often collapsed under their own complexity, with investigators unable to definitively prove coordination between seemingly independent companies. What Danielle had brought them, records tracing the holding entity's ownership, financial documents showing payment flows, and first-hand knowledge of how the business had historically operated, gave investigators something they rarely had this early in a case: a credible insider perspective paired with hard documentation. The state investigators who reviewed Danielle's information moved with a seriousness that surprised even Wallace, who had expected the case to take months to gain traction. Within their first meeting, lead investigator Camille Voss recognized the pattern Wallace had identified as consistent with several other bid rigging cases her unit had prosecuted in neighboring counties over the previous 5 years. She explained to Danielle that cases like this often collapsed under their own complexity, with investigators unable to definitively prove coordination between seemingly independent companies. What Danielle had brought them, records tracing the holding entity's ownership, financial documents showing payment flows, and first-hand knowledge of how the business had historically operated, gave investigators something they rarely had this early in a case: a credible insider perspective paired with hard documentation. Camille spent much of that first meeting explaining to Danielle exactly what cooperation would involve, being careful not to make promises about how the case would ultimately unfold, but outlining honestly the protections typically available to individuals who came forward proactively rather than waiting to be discovered. She explained that Danielle's decision to bring this information forward voluntarily, rather than after being subpoenaed or implicated independently, would almost certainly shape how prosecutors viewed her role throughout the case. Danielle asked pointed questions of her own during that meeting, wanting to understand not just her own legal exposure, but what would actually happen to the neighborhoods affected by the inflated contracts, whether restitution was realistic, whether the drainage problems she had seen firsthand would ever actually be fixed. Camille did not offer easy reassurances, telling Danielle honestly that outcomes in cases like this varied widely, but she promised that the information Danielle was providing would be taken seriously and pursued thoroughly, a promise that proved, over the following months, to be entirely true. Over the following 4 months, the investigation expanded quietly and carefully, with federal auditors eventually joining the state's public corruption unit, once it became clear that some of the infrastructure contracts involved partial federal funding, which elevated the case into overlapping federal jurisdiction. Investigators subpoenaed banking records for all 4 subcontracting companies, uncovering wire transfers that moved money between accounts in patterns that made little sense for genuinely independent competitors, but made perfect sense for a single coordinated operation designed to appear otherwise. They found emails, recovered from a company server during a lawful search, in which Marcus explicitly discussed with an associate how to structure bid amounts across the different companies to ensure his primary business consistently won the largest contracts while avoiding the appearance of a single entity monopolizing city work. Marcus had no idea any of this was happening. He continued operating his business normally throughout those months, closing new deals, expanding his client base, appearing at community events as the successful, self-made face of Charlotte's construction industry. He had convinced himself in the years since his divorce that Danielle had faded entirely from any relevance to his professional life, that the settlement had cleanly separated her from the business in every way that mattered. He had no reason to suspect that the small, seemingly meaningless holding entity he had used years earlier for what he considered routine tax efficiency was, at that very moment, the central piece of evidence in a federal investigation that would soon dismantle everything he had built. The morning the investigators arrived at Marcus's office began like any other. He was reviewing bid documents for an upcoming contract, drinking coffee at his desk, half listening to a voicemail from a supplier, when his assistant told him a man was waiting in the lobby asking to speak with him privately. Marcus assumed it was a vendor or a potential client, someone he could handle in 10 minutes before returning to his morning. The man introduced himself as a federal investigator, presented identification, and asked Marcus if there was somewhere private they could talk. It was only in that conference room, the same kind of room where Marcus had once signed away what he believed was Danielle's future in his business, that he began to understand the full scope of what was happening. The investigators laid out methodically and without emotion the pattern of bid coordination they had traced across 4 subcontracting companies, the wire transfers, the shared formatting in bid documents, the emails recovered from his own server. Marcus sat in stunned silence as they explained that the holding entity at the center of it all, the one he had used to structure these arrangements, was co-owned, on paper and by law, by his ex-wife, and that her cooperation with investigators had provided critical documentation that helped build the case against him. Marcus asked, according to people later familiar with the meeting, how Danielle could possibly still be listed as an owner of that entity, insisting it had been resolved during their divorce. The investigators showed him the settlement language his own attorney had drafted, the clause that transferred only future profit claims, not underlying ownership, the exact language Renata Cole had quietly allowed to pass through the final settlement 2 years earlier. Colleagues who spoke with Marcus in the days following that meeting described a man who seemed genuinely unable to process what had happened, repeating to at least one close associate that he had read the settlement summary his attorney provided at the time, that he trusted his own lawyer to protect his interests, and that he never imagined the fine print of a document he was so eager to finalize could come back to define the rest of his life. He reportedly called Griffin Okafor multiple times that same afternoon, demanding an explanation for how the clause had been drafted the way it was, though by then the damage, both legal and personal, was already irreversible. What had once felt to Marcus like a swift, decisive victory over a marriage he no longer wanted had revealed itself, in a single conference room conversation, to be the most consequential mistake of his entire career. It took several more months for the full legal process to unfold, months during which Marcus's business slowly came apart as news of the federal investigation became public, as clients quietly withdrew, as subcontractors distanced themselves from a company now associated with public corruption. Marcus was formally indicted on multiple counts of bid rigging, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud a government entity, charges that carried the possibility of significant prison time and financial penalties that would ultimately exceed the value of everything he had built over nearly 2 decades. His attorney negotiated aggressively, but the documentation investigators had gathered, much of it made possible by Danielle's cooperation and the records she had carefully preserved since her divorce, left little room for the kind of defense Marcus's legal team had hoped to construct. Local news stations picked up the story within days of the indictment becoming public record, and for a brief but intense stretch of weeks, Marcus Whitfield's name appeared regularly in Charlotte news coverage, a jarring reversal for a man who had spent years cultivating a public image built entirely around community trust and civic pride. Reporters camped briefly outside the company's headquarters, interviewing former clients and city officials who had once praised Marcus publicly for his contributions to local development. Several city council members who had supported awarding contracts to his company found themselves fielding uncomfortable questions about oversight and due diligence. And at least 2 municipal employees involved in reviewing the original bids were placed on administrative leave, pending a broader review of the city's procurement process. The story, which began as a quiet legal filing, had within a month become a genuine local scandal, one that raised uncomfortable questions about how easily a well-connected businessman had been able to manipulate a system meant to protect taxpayer money. Danielle largely avoided this media attention, declining every interview request that reached her through Renata's office, preferring to let the legal process unfold without adding her own voice to the public spectacle surrounding it. She continued running her small consulting business during this period, telling only a handful of close friends and family members the full extent of what was happening, unwilling to let Marcus's unraveling become the defining story of her own daily life. It was, she would later say, one of the more difficult periods of the entire ordeal, watching from a distance as the public conversation around her former marriage grew louder and more distorted, while she quietly continued the private work of rebuilding a life that had nothing to do with headlines. The trial itself lasted just over 2 weeks, and Danielle testified on the 4th day, called by prosecutors to walk the court through the origins of the holding entity, the paperwork she had signed years earlier, and the circumstances under which she had come to understand what the entity was later used for. She spoke plainly, without visible anger, describing the sequence of events with the same careful precision Renata had taught her to bring to every piece of paperwork since her divorce began. Marcus sat at the defense table throughout her testimony, and those present in the courtroom later described the moment he seemed to fully understand what had happened as the instant investigators displayed, on a screen for the jury, the exact clause from his own divorce settlement, the clause his attorney had rushed to draft, the clause that preserved Danielle's ownership stake instead of erasing it. He had signed away his own protection in his rush to close a marriage he no longer valued, never imagining that the woman he dismissed as someone who understood nothing about his business was the one detail standing between him and everything he was about to lose. Under cross-examination, Marcus's defense attorney attempted repeatedly to paint Danielle as a bitter ex-wife acting out of revenge, suggesting she had manufactured her cooperation with investigators to punish Marcus for the affair and the divorce that followed. Danielle answered each question calmly, pointing out that she had not sought out investigators, that she had come forward only after learning independently that the entity still bearing her name was actively being used in ways that affected real infrastructure projects and real families. When the attorney pressed her on whether she felt any satisfaction watching Marcus face these charges, Danielle paused for a long moment before answering that she felt no satisfaction at all, only relief that the neighborhoods harmed by the scheme would finally see some form of accountability, and that her own name was no longer quietly attached to something she had never fully understood. Several jurors later told local reporters that her composure during that exchange was one of the more memorable moments of the entire trial. Judge Alvin Pierce, who had presided over both the original divorce proceedings and, by coincidence of the court's rotation schedule, several of the pretrial hearings in the criminal case, was noted by courtroom observers to have reviewed the original settlement language personally before ruling on a pretrial motion Marcus's attorneys filed attempting to have Danielle's testimony excluded on the grounds that her ownership stake had been improperly preserved through what they called a drafting error rather than genuine legal ownership. Judge Pierce rejected the motion firmly, noting from the bench that Marcus's own legal team had drafted, reviewed, and formally executed the settlement language in question, and that a party cannot later disown the consequences of a contract simply because those consequences turned out to be unfavorable. The ruling effectively sealed the fate of Marcus's defense strategy before the trial had even reached its midpoint. The jury returned a guilty verdict on the majority of charges, and Marcus was ultimately sentenced to several years in federal prison, along with substantial financial restitution tied to the inflated contract, amounts the scheme had cost the city over its operation. His company, the one he had built from a used pickup truck and years of relentless ambition, was dissolved as part of the legal proceedings, its remaining assets seized to help cover restitution and penalties. Tasha, who had built her own public identity around being the wife of a successful, respected businessman, filed for divorce within weeks of the verdict, unwilling to remain connected to a man now defined publicly by fraud rather than success. Marcus, in the span of little more than a year, lost the business, the marriage he had left Danielle for, and the reputation he had spent 2 decades constructing. Danielle did not attend sentencing. She had said everything she needed to say during her testimony, and she felt no desire to witness Marcus's final public unraveling. What she did receive, in the months following the case's resolution, was a formal settlement from the dissolution of the holding entity, her legally documented ownership stake entitling her to a portion of its remaining value once restitution and penalties were accounted for. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to fully fund the consulting business she had been quietly rebuilding, enough to secure her daughter's education without financial strain, enough to represent, in very concrete terms, the value of something Marcus had once dismissed as worthless paperwork he never bothered to read closely. In the 2 years since the trial concluded, Danielle has built her interior design consulting business into a respected regional firm, taking on clients who value the same careful, detail-oriented approach that once helped her catch a single overlooked clause buried on page 11 of a settlement Marcus assumed would end her involvement in his life entirely. She rarely speaks publicly about the case, and when she does, she speaks not with bitterness but with a kind of clear-eyed reflection on how easily people underestimate the quiet, careful work that often holds a life or a business together behind the scenes. She has said in the few interviews she has given that she never set out to bring Marcus down, that she simply refused to remain ignorant of something that still carried her name, and that the rest followed from decisions Marcus made entirely on his own. Decisions rooted in the same carelessness and arrogance that had defined the final years of their marriage. Danielle's daughters, both now in their early 20s, have described watching their mother move through those years as one of the defining influences on how they think about their own futures. Her older daughter, who recently finished a graduate degree in public policy, has said publicly that watching her mother refuse to be dismissed shaped how she approaches every negotiation in her own career, from salary discussions to disagreements with colleagues who assume, wrongly, that quiet composure means an absence of preparation underneath it. Danielle has been careful not to frame her story as a lesson she deliberately set out to teach her children, but she acknowledges that the example mattered more than any conversation she could have had with them directly about what happened. Marcus, according to public records, remains in federal custody, with a projected release still several years away. Those who knew him during the height of his success describe a man who genuinely believed he had outmaneuvered every obstacle in front of him, who treated his marriage the same way he treated a difficult contract negotiation, something to be closed quickly and on his terms, without much thought given to the fine print. What he never accounted for was that the woman he spent years dismissing had spent those same years quietly learning exactly how contracts, businesses, and paperwork actually worked. Knowledge that ultimately protected her far more than he ever anticipated, and exposed him in ways he never saw coming until it was far too late to change course. Former colleagues who worked alongside Marcus during the height of his company's growth have since described, in conversations following the trial, a pattern they say they noticed but never felt empowered to question, a tendency for Marcus to treat every relationship, personal or professional, as something to be managed rather than genuinely valued. One former project manager recalled Marcus once saying, during a company retreat years before the divorce, that the secret to his success was never letting anyone get too comfortable, including the people closest to him. At the time, it was repeated as a kind of motivational business philosophy. In hindsight, several people who heard it have said it reads very differently, less like ambition and more like a warning about how easily he was willing to treat people, including his own wife, as obstacles to be managed rather than partners to be respected. What strikes many people who learn this story is not simply the twist of fate, but the quiet lesson underneath it, the reminder that the people we underestimate often understand far more than we give them credit for, and that carelessness, especially the kind born from arrogance, has a way of resurfacing long after we assume it has been buried for good. Marcus believed he had won the day he signed those divorce papers. He believed he had closed the door on Danielle's relevance to his life and his business entirely. Instead, he had unknowingly preserved the one thread that would eventually unravel everything he built, all because he was too impatient, too dismissive, and too certain of his own control to read the fine print of a document he assumed would never matter again. Would you have caught that clause if you were sitting across the table that day, or would it have slipped past you the same way it slipped past Marcus? If this story left you thinking about how easily the people closest to us can be underestimated, let us know in the comments what stood out to you most, and if you want to hear another true story of someone who turned being overlooked into their greatest advantage, make sure you're subscribed, because the next one might be even harder to believe.